Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14. Today we will be going through all of the bowl games here in season number 3. If you missed the last episode, I highly recommend you check it out because in that episode we revealed the teams who are going to the college football playoff along with all of the other big awards and whatnot. I think the committee, you guys, ultimately did a pretty good job with the votes, and this is what our college football playoff bracket will ultimately look like. The playoff itself will start in the next episode, but rather today we are going through all of the other bowl games, so the non-playoff teams will get the opportunity to finish out their seasons. We also went through all of the awards in the last episode, including the Heisman Trophy, and you guys voted that we give the award to Duke quarterback Justin Tucker, a very well-deserved honor for the Blue Devil signal caller, and we will get to see his Blue Devils in the next episode during the college football playoff. Let's shift our attention to the other bowl games, and while, yes, this is not exactly the playoff, these are still usually some fun games. You do have to keep in mind, in NCAA 14, there's only a 2-team national championship, so because of that, the other 10 teams who are in the playoff but not in technically the national championship, they are all in bowl games. So what I decided to do is for the teams who are playing against somebody who isn't in the college football playoff, for example, I'm pretty sure Arizona plays against Duke. Obviously, Duke is in the playoff right there in the Sun Bowl, but Arizona is not. So Arizona's going to play against somebody who is also facing off against a playoff team like Notre Dame. They're playing against Oklahoma in the Outback Bowl, but since Oklahoma's in the playoff, they are not going to participate in the Outback Bowl. I hope that makes sense. There was only so much I would be able to do with NCAA 14's limitations. Another thing is that in the past, I've highlighted through all of the bowl games. Today, I decided to only focus on some of the more relevant ones while briefly going over the rest without highlights. We'll start with Michigan and Rice in the Beef O'Brady's Bowl. Michigan is coming off a very disappointing season. After making the college football playoff 2 years in a row, they only went 6-6 this year and are playing in the Beef O'Brady's Bowl. Things would not get a whole lot better tonight as they would fall victim to Rice. Quarterback Johnny Woodman threw for 4 scores as Rice would beat Michigan 31-21, and the Wolverines finished their season under 500 with a record of 6-7. Now, Rice is no pushover. We see that here today as they beat Michigan. Rice comes from the American Athletic, a pretty talented Group 5 conference, while Michigan's got to go back to the drawing board. Their freshman quarterback, Callaghan October, was benched after recording a passer rating of 0 in the first drive, and they wanted to give senior quarterback TJ Callaway an opportunity to play through the rest of the game. A good gesture by Michigan, but it will not help them get the win. Idaho was a team who was on the at-large ballot for the college football playoff. They did not get in, but I do want to mention them here as they did go 11-1. They won the Mountain West. They're playing against Fresno State. Idaho would continue to show off their high-octane passing offense as senior quarterback Jace Salazar would continue to dominate, throwing 3 touchdowns here, and Idaho will win the Las Vegas Bowl over Fresno State by the score of 41-21. Idaho quarterback Jace Salazar is a senior, so he will be gone after this season. However, all of their weapons will be back. They've got a young group of offensive skill position players. The tight ends, Koskich is a true freshman, and then the wide receiver duo, Colin Robinson and Soup El Capitan, are both going to be juniors next year. As for Fresno State, pretty successful season for them in just their second year in the Pac-12 as they go 8-5. Next up, we take a look at UCLA and Akron in the Little Caesars Pizza Bowl. The MAC is a very tough conference. There are some good teams in there, including the Akron Zips. They still came into this game as the underdog, but they would get the upset win over UCLA 31-29. The star of the show was junior wide receiver Kyrese Telekton III. He had 2 receiving touchdowns and also took a kick return to the house. And going into his senior season, assuming he doesn't declare for the draft, will be one of the names to watch in the MAC conference. Telekton had 6 catches for 134 yards, along with his 3 all-purpose touchdowns. As for UCLA, they finished under 500. They had some impressive wins this year. They beat Oregon, who's in the playoffs, but ultimately UCLA wasn't very consistent to end the year. The reigning national champion TCU Horned Frogs go from the Natty to the Holiday Bowl against Stanford. TCU decided to do senior quarterback Cade Brown a nice gesture by having him play the entire game today, and Brown was solid, scoring 2 rushing touchdowns. This is the guy who was projected to be TCU's starter 2 years in a row, but lost the battle both seasons in spring camp. While Cade Brown played pretty well in his final collegiate game, TCU's defense was not so good, as wide receiver Boogie Baker had 140 yards and 2 touchdowns for Stanford, and this late touchdown by running back Rudolph Moore would push the game away. Stanford would end up taking the win 24-21. A really solid season for Stanford, and I know things started off red hot with them. They were 6-0. They really looked like they could have been this year's version of TCU, and while that didn't happen, it was still a very successful season for them. As for TCU, obviously a disappointment going from winning the national championship to 7-6, losing the Holiday Bowl. Next up, we had the Military Bowl between Buffalo and Miami. For much of the year, Miami looked like a playoff contender, but once starting quarterback Scooty Young suffered a season-ending injury, things went downhill quickly. Their projected starting quarterback next year, Luke Burnett, has not played all that well until today. Burnett had by far his best game with the Hurricanes, really giving Miami some confidence in him being their starting quarterback this upcoming season, as Miami would win this one 50-34 in a very high-scoring matchup. Luke Burnett threw for 336 yards and 4 touchdowns, really giving Miami some excitement for next season at the quarterback position. As for Buffalo, I had bigger expectations for them this year. They were the runners-up in the MAC last year, and they weren't bad this season, but ultimately I thought they were going to do a little bit better than 7-6, largely because some of their elite prospects on the defensive side of the ball were pretty disappointing this season. Memphis facing off against North Carolina here in the Advocare 100 Bowl. North Carolina started their season off really poorly, but they played very well down the stretch. And of course, they had that big win against Duke to end the year, 58-53, which kept Duke out of the ACC championship and nearly kept them out of the playoffs entirely. North Carolina's offense would keep up their momentum today as quarterback Graham Fisher had a great send-off in his final collegiate game. UNC would win 42-33, with Fisher throwing for 380 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jalen West ran for 3 on the ground as well, but Memphis' offense gave a great fight as well. Quarterback Jari Evans threw for 4 scores, but was unable to get the job done as North Carolina takes the win and finishes the season above 500. Next up, we'll take a look at number 13 Florida State, who was also on the bid for being an at-large playoff team. Ultimately, that kind of fell through. They're facing off against the UAB Blazers, who were 1 play away from winning the American Athletic Conference Championship. UAB's offense was pretty solid today, and they ran the ball. However, the formerly number 1 scoring defense struggled, allowing 40 points to the Florida State offense, as FSU would win this one 40-30. This feels like another disappointing season for Florida State because the past few seasons they've been so close to the playoff but lose a game they shouldn't towards the end of the season, which ultimately keeps them out. And that was the case again this year. Jacob King in his final collegiate game only completed 6 passes, but he had some big-time throws despite also missing a lot of throws. I'm curious to see when and ultimately if he ends up getting drafted at the next level, most likely as a day 3 prospect, although it was nice to see Romani Pierre-Cross play really well. As for UAB, their quarterback Bonaromas did not throw the ball well, and on the ground, similarly to why they lost the American Athletic Conference Championship, they gave the quarterback more carries than their running back, Higashioka Miyamoto, who has been the engine of their offense this season. Despite missing out on getting one of the at-large playoff spots, this was still a very successful season for South Alabama, going 10-2 in the American Athletic after missing a bowl game last year. South Alabama, of course, is led by their high-octane offense and senior quarterback Q.J. Redding, who finished as a Heisman finalist and was second in the Davey O'Brien Award voting. Redding's had a great send-off, throwing 4 touchdowns in this game, catapulting his season total to 56. 2 of those touchdowns were caught by junior wide receiver Sammy Woosas, who finished second in the Fred Biletnikoff Award voting. South Alabama wins 45-35, then they finish the season 11-2. A great bounce-back season for South Alabama, with Kujay Reddings rising his draft stock throughout the year, finishing with 56 passing touchdowns on the season, which is just 2 shy of the all-time record. Dante Tillman and Sammy Wusus were both awesome, and both of them will be back next season. As for FIU, they finished 7-6. Nothing overly special there. Pretty mediocre season from them. Number 22, Washington missed out on an at-large bid into the playoff after they had an opportunity to get an automatic bid in the Pac-12 championship game, in which they got smothered by California. I think after that Pac-12 championship game, Washington really lifted their foot off the gas pedal, and boy, did it show today, as they would end up getting upset by the Vanderbilt Commodores with a nice game on the ground from running back Guinness Talladega. Vanderbilt wins 38-24, a disappointing end to the season for Washington, who won 10 regular season games, but got steamrolled in the conference championship against Cal, and didn't look like they really cared in this game against Vandy. Quarterback Trey Libby did not play well, but clearly he didn't really need to. Speaking of teams who missed out on the playoff, Navy finished tied for 12th place in the playoff vote with Oklahoma, but because of a tiebreaker, Navy missed out on the playoff. Instead, they'll face off against South Carolina here in the Peach Bowl. South Carolina quarterback Marco Prince would return from injury after missing most of the year, and he played pretty well before getting re-injured. Not ideal for his draft stock. As for Navy, they really leaned on running back John Dorsey after their starting running back Torian Wilson got injured in the ACC championship game, a matchup in which Navy lost to Virginia Tech 29-0. Ultimately, this game would go into overtime, but it would be South Carolina who got the win with a game-winning touchdown from senior running back Braylon Murphy. 34-28 your final. A disappointing end to the season here for Navy, who showed today that they certainly didn't belong in the likes of teams like Oklahoma and Oregon, who snuck into the college football playoff with at-large bids. I think it's fair to say Navy is nowhere near the level that they are, despite a really good performance today from John Dorsey. South Carolina finishes 8-5, a very rocky season for them with Marco Prince's injury and then today his re-injury, so hopefully he won't really affect his draft stock and he can still participate in the combine and whatnot. Tennessee faces off against Michigan State up next here in the Gator Bowl. The Spartans never looked like they had any chance of contending for anything this season, but I still feel like I did you guys a disservice because we didn't talk about Michigan State enough. Their quarterback, Jay Jordan, looks like he could be one of the top quarterbacks off the board in next year's draft after having a great season. Jordan threw for 5 touchdowns today, finishing with a touchdown-to-interception ratio of 50-3. Yes, you heard me right. He threw for 50 touchdowns this year and only threw 3 interceptions. Since the team was kind of mediocre, that's why he was left off the Heisman watch, and his team really looked mediocre today, as despite Jordan throwing 5 touchdowns, they still lost to Tennessee, as senior quarterback Benjamin McKenzie would finish his Tennessee career off with a bang. 52-38 your final. Both teams finish 8-5. Overall, I'm really excited to see what Jay Jordan will be able to do next year with a lot more hype and exposure his way. He will be without his number 1 wide receiver, Ajon Wiggins, who is expected to be a first or second round pick in this year's NFL draft. Benjamin McKenzie had a very rocky collegiate career with injuries and inconsistencies. He didn't really live up to expectations, but boy did he play well today. Probably the best game of his collegiate career. Next up, we have Texas and Cincinnati facing off against each other in the Cotton Bowl. Kind of a home field advantage for Texas, and you can tell with all of the orange in the crowd. Texas missed out on a college football playoff bid despite winning their final 6 games of the regular season, and they were able to carry the momentum into this game with a nice win here against Cincinnati, who of course nearly made the playoff as the Big 12 champions, but of course they had to choke a 21-3 lead against Baylor, 31-24 your final. Seth Maddox did not play all that well for the Bearcats, who finished 9-5. As for Texas, can we say that they are back? I mean, they won 10 games this year and have been playing their best football down the stretch. Now, Texas is going to have expectations next season, and if I've learned anything about this Texas team, once you give them expectations, they suck. We'll see if next year ends up being different. Bowling Green got a lot of love to make a college football playoff spot. They ultimately missed out on one of the at-large bids, but now they have a new large fan base behind them, and they were able to get another win on the victory column here against Georgia State. 33-21 in the GoDaddy.com Bowl. Quarterback Elijah Ebike threw for 4 touchdowns, 2 of which were caught by tight end Isaiah Deloach, who finished in the top 3 for the John Mackey Award voting. I still think the committee did a good job of leaving Bowling Green outside of the playoff because I don't think they're better than anybody in that bracket. But Bowling Green still had a fantastic season this year, going 13-1. And assuming Middle Tennessee State goes to a Power 5 conference next year, Bowling Green will likely be the early season favorite to be the Group 5 team who gets an automatic bid into the college football playoff. We have 2 more bowl games to go, and as I mentioned early, there are some teams playing against playoff teams, so I kind of had to mesh them together. We'll start with USF and Arizona facing off against each other here in the Sun Bowl. This game ended up being the biggest blowout of bowl season as Kareem Kamara, the senior quarterback, in his final game with Arizona, put a stamp in his collegiate career, scoring 4 touchdowns today, 2 in the air, 2 on the ground, as Arizona wins 52-7. I had to do some stuff on some different save files, so don't worry about the records on the left. The rosters are the same. That's really all that matters. Kareem Kamara, 166 passing yards and 2 scores to go along with a busy day on the ground, 66 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's expected to be a first or second round pick in this year's upcoming NFL draft and hopes to be somebody's franchise quarterback. As for USF, they had a pretty good season, but a big disappointment and an unfortunate ending to quarterback Donovan Ferguson's collegiate career. And it will wrap up with the Outback Bowl between Notre Dame and Clemson, 2 teams who missed out on at-large bids in the playoff. I personally think Clemson deserved to get one of those spots, but Clemson did not look like a playoff team today, put it that way, as they got steamrolled. MJ Hill, the senior running back for Notre Dame, has been one of the most accomplished players in the country over these last few seasons, as Notre Dame wins 45-21. Again, don't worry about the records. Obviously, Notre Dame is not number 2 in the country. MJ Hill with 3 rushing touchdowns in his final game with Notre Dame. He's expected to be one of the first couple of running backs off the board in this year's upcoming NFL draft. Next year, Baz Boyd is certainly going to have to do more as a passer if Notre Dame wants to contend for a playoff spot. As for Clemson, a disappointing end of the season. They finished 10-3. Obviously, they had high expectations after making the national championship last year, but potentially with another year of development from quarterback Cedric Chapman, maybe next year's an improvement for the Tigers. As we quickly take a look at the games I did not highlight, UL Lafayette upsets Colorado, Southern Miss beats Eastern Michigan, Iowa defeats Nevada, UConn gets over the Sun Belt champion Texas State Wildcats. UNLV upsets Tulane. Going down the board a little bit here, we have NC State beating Old Dominion in the Belk Bowl. Minnesota defeats Illinois in the Car Care Bowl. The Illini lose their final 3 games of the year after starting 8-2. Virginia defeats Boise State in the Fight Hunger Bowl. Pitt finishes their first season in the Big Ten in a strong way, beating Iowa State. Georgia Tech, with a much better season than last year, they defeat Mississippi State. The Conference USA champion UTEP Miners upset Arkansas. And then Penn State beats Kansas State. Second consecutive season that Penn State beats Kansas State in a bowl game. Again, we don't have to worry about these games, but we do have Texas Tech beating West Virginia. And obviously, we went over the Bowling Green game. As for players of the week, for bowl week, there's like 4 different sets. I don't know why, but yeah, there are plenty of players of the week throughout the bowl games. Kyrese Telekton, the Akron receiver, I would say certainly was the most impressive, although Benjamin McKenzie for Tennessee was great as well. So that'll wrap up the bowl episode, and now the only thing standing in our way before we end the season is the college football playoff. And in the next episode, we will go through the first round games: Alabama versus Oklahoma, Ohio State versus Baylor, Georgia versus Oregon, and Middle Tennessee State versus Duke. The next episode will have those first round of games. The following episode will have the next round, and then the episode after that will be the Final Four and National Championship. So that's going to wrap up today's episode. I know it was a short one, but since I went over less bowl games than normal, we were able to get through this one pretty quickly. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.